Go ahead and take your seats. We need a couple more minutes. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Understanding.
You said I could administer you all.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
when we get to that, it's good.
Please rise to the jury.
Thank you. Take your seats, please. Mr. Sexauer, good afternoon. Let me ask you to please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of law?
I do.
Thank you. Go ahead and take your seat. Make yourself comfortable. Come up to the microphone and you can adjust it to wherever you like. Why don't you begin this afternoon by giving us your full and complete name and the spelling of your last name?
Sure. It's Joshua Robert Sexauer, S-E-X-A-U-E-R.
All right, thank you. Mr. Clark, you can begin with your direct examination of Mr. Sexauer.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell the jury where you live?
I live in Las Cruces, New Mexico.
And what is your profession?
I just ended a term position with New Mexico State University. I teach classes there.
Okay. And what classes do you teach?
I teach computer programming and manufacturing processes.
And I think you just completed maybe a graduate degree recently?
Yeah, I just got my PhD last December.
So you're a professor at State?
Well, I guess it's not a tenure. Yeah, a little maybe.
Okay.
Sorry.
Do you know Tai Chan?
Wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Do you know Tai Chan?
I do know Tai Chan.
Tell the jury how you know Mr. Chan.
I've known him since we were kids.
Okay.
We grew up together.
Did you grow up in Santa Fe?
I grew up in Santa Fe.
And how old were you when the two of you met?
I remember third grade. I guess that puts me at about 8 years old or so.
Was there ever a time that you lost contact with Mr. Chan?
Yeah, we went to different middle schools and high schools, so I didn't see him much through those years.
And did the two of you become reacquainted when you began college together?
Yeah, we did.
All right. And do you consider Mr. Chan to be a friend?
Absolutely.
Now, Mr. Sexauer, you know you're under oath today, right?
Yes.
And you know you're sworn to tell the truth, right?
Yes.
And have you given statements to the police regarding information that you have in this case?
I did, yes.
Okay. Now, who are you married to, Josh?
I'm married to Susanna Sexauer.
Okay. Is there or was there a connection between Susanna, your wife, and Ty at one point in time?
Yes, she was married to Ty previously.
Okay. So you're married to Ty Chan's ex,
Yes.
but you're still his friend?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, on the evening of October 27th, do you remember that evening, 2014?
Yes.
Okay. Tell the jury, if you will, when you first had contact, if you did have contact with Mr. Chan on the evening of October 27, 2014.
I believe it was around 8 o'clock. I know it's in the statement. I believe it was around 8 o'clock he called me.
Okay. And was this call out of the blue, or had you communicated with him recently, in the recent past before that?
It was more out of the blue than that we've been communicating recently.
Okay. And without getting into the specifics of the phone conversation, did the two of you make plans?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you learn based on that phone conversation?
That he was coming to Las Cruces with another gentleman, and that they wanted to hang out.
And were plans made to go out?
Yes.
And were plans made for you, for the arrangements for them to be picked up?
Yes, after I got a phone with Ty, I called my friend Ian Robles and asked him if he wanted to join us. And so he picked me up, and then we were going to go pick them up.
And where did you go to pick them up?
A hotel in Kanto.
And who was driving?
Ian.
And was it in Ian's car or your car?
It was Ian's car.
Okay. And had any plans been made for there to be somebody to be the sober driver?
Well, I know that Ian had to work, so he was planning to remain sober, so it worked out real nice.
And did you, in fact, arrive in Kanto to pick up Josh up Ty and his friend?
Yes.
And had you ever met the individual that Ty was with that night?
No.
Do you now know that individual's name?
Yes, Jeremy Martin.
And had you ever met Mr. Martin before at all in any capacity?
No.
And when you, where did you plan to go? Where were you guys going to go?
We plan to go to Dublin's.
Is that that's a place that you've gone to drink before?
Yeah, it's right on University.
Okay. Right across from campus?
Yeah, right across from campus.
And do you recall anything unusual or anything that struck you as out of the ordinary when Ty and Josh got into the car? I mean, Ty and Jeremy got into the car.
Can you be more specific?
Well, did Jeremy say anything to Ty when they got into the car?
Yes, he was a little louder, and I do remember him saying something pretty quickly about, I just told this lady that Ty was a fag, kind of something like that.
Okay. And did it appear to be serious, or did it appear to be joking?
It definitely seemed to be a joke to me.
Was it off-putting to you at all?
Well, I didn't think it was that funny, but yeah, it didn't offend me that much, I guess. But
did when the two of them got into the car, other than that what you've described as that joke or that comment, did they appear to be angry with each other?
No, definitely not.
Okay. And what was the mood in the car when you were driving to the bar?
Normal, happy, I don't know.
Okay. Did either one of them appear to have consumed alcohol prior to getting in the car?
I believe they had, yes.
Okay. Were they coherent?
Yes.
What makes you think they'd been drinking?
Again, they were pretty loud, and they had told me pretty quickly after they got in the car that they had a few drinks at some places.
And what was your mood? Were you excited about this?
Oh yeah.
This evening? And you hadn't seen Ty for a while, right?
Yeah, I hadn't seen Ty for a while. I was excited.
So did you make any stops, or did you go directly to the bar?
Oh, we went right to the bar.
Okay. And what happened when you got there?
We went inside. I don't know.
You got down, went in?
Yeah, got out, went in, and sat down.
And where did you sit?
If I remember, near the bar, but one of the tables near the bar.
And this bar we're talking about, you've been there many times?
I've been there, yeah. I've been there more than once.
All the four of you ordered drinks. Do you recall if there were shots, if there were cocktails, if there were beers?
I believe we got there and ordered shots of Fireball.
Okay. And when we say we, it would have been who?
Me, Ty, and Jeremy.
Because we've already established that Ian was remaining sober.
Yeah.
And did it stay that way over the course of the evening? Did Ian ever decide that he was going to maybe not be the sober driver?
Ian never drank.
Okay. So the first round, do you recall who paid for it?
I don't recall who paid for it. It was either Ty Chan or Jeremy Martin. I don't know.
Okay. You didn't care because the liquor was there and you weren't paying, right?
No. Well, we had 2 rounds of the Fireball, and I know that Ty paid for one, and Jeremy. I believe Ty paid for one, and Jeremy paid for the other one. So I don't know who paid for the first round.
Okay. I gotcha. And Was the mood light?
Happy.
How would you describe the mood after this first round of shots?
Happy for sure.
Okay.
Friendly.
About what time, if you remember, did you get there?
So if he called at 8, I know he had to pick me up, I would say around 9:15 maybe.
Okay. And during the first hour or so, did the mood remain the same?
My timing isn't great, but I would say yes, in general, yes, the first hour or so was fine.
Okay. Now, are you familiar with a young woman named Nicole?
Yes.
And who do you know that she to be related to?
She's related to Tai Chan.
Okay. And you know her to be his cousin?
Yes.
Okay. At any point in the evening, did Nicole join you at the bar?
She did.
Okay. And if you can recall, was she consuming alcohol? Was she drinking?
I don't believe she was, but I don't recall. I wasn't really monitoring that at all.
Did you talk to Nicole?
I'm sure I talked to her a little bit, yes.
Now, she's substantially younger than you are, right?
Yes.
Did you know her from school, or had you already graduated?
Well, I went to school for like 12 years, so
Okay.
I guess
You're still
10 years.
Right.
So I think I was in school when she was in school at some point, but yes, she's definitely younger than me.
Okay. At any point in time during the course of the evening, did the mood change?
Yes.
Please describe for the jury what you recall about the mood in the bar between your group changing.
But everything was pretty friendly and light, and then all of a sudden, I don't really recall a reason, but I saw that Jeremy Martin was upset.
Did you hear the exchange or anything that might have caused Jeremy to become upset?
I don't recall what caused him to get upset.
Okay. Now, after the first round of alcohol, first round of shots, what was everybody drinking, if you remember?
Okay, I think we had 2 rounds of the Fireball,
Okay.
and after that, I don't know what other people were drinking.
Okay. Were you just drinking beer, or were you having cocktails?
I had a couple beers after that.
Okay. All right. Now, how did you plan on getting home? Was Ian going to take you home?
Yeah.
And so this was a night out with friends, right?
Yes.
Did the mood stay dark, or did it ever change over time?
Well, I didn't hang out with that group a whole lot, throughout the night. There was other people at the bar that I was hanging out with, probably more than them.
Okay.
So I would say, and I wouldn't say that it was dark at any point either. I don't think that that's the word I would use.
Okay.
Jeremy was a little upset, but I don't think it was a dark mood. I would say that for a while anyways, there was some agitation.
You recall giving at least 2 statements to either the police or investigators during the course?
Yes, yes.
And do you recall indicating that one of the reasons you were actually talking with other people is because both of these guys were being kind of annoying?
Yes.
And is that a fair recollection or a fair statement of both of their demeanors?
Yes.
And do you recall having said in the past that this night was kind of a disappointment, not because what happened later, but just because it wasn't very much fun?
Yes.
Because Jeremy and Ty continued to argue with one another?
Yes.
Did you ever really know what they were arguing about?
No.
And have you been made aware of later of what they were arguing about?
Yes.
But at the time you didn't know?
No.
Okay. Now, do you ever recall describe for the jury, if you will, the relationship? Was it a disagreement? Was it an argument? What was going on between Jeremy and Ty?
I don't know. I guess I don't understand. Sorry.
Did you ever see them verbally being confrontational with each other?
Yes. Yeah. So again, the first thing I noticed was Ty was at the bar, and he asked Jeremy, "Hey, bro, do you want a drink?" And Jeremy said, like, "Water. I just want water." And I was like, "What happened?"
Okay. And did you ever see any physical confrontation between either one of them?
No.
Okay. Do you remember talking to an investigator shortly after the shooting and telling that investigator that that you recall them talking something about a double homicide?
I know I spoke with an investigator. I don't really recall much of that talk, I guess.
Okay. If I showed you a report from that investigator based on his conversation with you, is it possible that would refresh your recollection?
It could.
Okay, may I approach with the judge?
Yes.
Give me a reference. Oh, sure.
These two paragraphs. Secretary, is that sufficient to refresh your recollection about their conversation?
I'm sorry. I can't. I just can't like find it in my mind, and I know I didn't have a chance to look over that statement, but I know I looked at my original statement with the police department, and there I know that I stated that I didn't remember the argument. So I guess I'm sorry. I just can't recollect myself remembering that argument.
You know, that's okay. It was a long time ago. So we'll talk about the things you can remember, okay? You do remember talking to the police right after the incident, right?
Yes.
And you talked to the police, I believe, at the hospital, right?
Yes.
All right, so let's back up a little bit and work forward. At some point in time, did you leave the bar?
Yes.
And about what time, if you know?
11, maybe 11:30.
Okay. And did Ian take you home?
Yes.
And when you got home, you weren't home very long, were you?
About a half an hour probably.
Okay. And who was home when you got home?
My wife.
Okay. And without talking about the content of any telephone call that you received, did you receive a phone call shortly after 12:30 or 12:45 that was very upsetting to you?
Yes.
All right. And who made that phone call to you?
Leah.
And that's Leah.
Leah Tafoya.
And who is Leah Tafoya, if you know?
She's now married to Tai Chen.
Okay. And did you know Leah before?
I believe I'd met her once.
Okay. So not a close friend.
No.
And based on the telephone conversation from Leah Tafoya, did you become upset?
Yes.
Okay. And in fact, you became really upset, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you took certain action, right?
Yes.
Where did you go?
First I called Ian and was asking him I was going to ask him if he wanted to come back and pick me up, but I don't believe he answered. So I asked my wife to drive me to the hotel in Kanto.
Okay. And when you got to the hotel in Kanto, what did you see?
Oh, we didn't actually get to hotel in Kanto. Once, I can't remember, somewhere on the road we could see that there was a lot of police officers at hotel in Kanto.
Okay.
And so we didn't actually make it there.
Now, did you have some device on your phone, like some sort of application on your smartphone that allowed you to listen in on police scanners?
Yes.
And tell the jury, if you will, did you utilize that application and were you able to gain any information?
I did. It's once I saw the police officers around Hotel in Kanto, that's when I started the app, because I guess before that I still couldn't believe that anything like this could have happened. So I started the app and heard something about shots fired and someone going to the hospital, something like that.
Okay. And what did you do after you learned this, that shots had been fired and somebody had gone to the hospital?
We went to the hospital, me and my wife.
Okay. And what if anything did you believe had transpired?
I thought Tai Chen was in the hospital.
Okay. And that was based on information you gathered from Leah Tafoya, right?
I don't recall if she had said something about that. my gut feeling was that Tai Chan was in the hospital.
And you thought Ty had been shot, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And when you got to the hospital, you were encountered by police officers, right?
Yes.
And both you and your wife were questioned by the police, right?
Yes.
And did you give them as detailed information as you could remember at the time?
The initial time, I was so panicked and, just so panicked that I don't even remember really anything that I said to that first police officer.
But then you were interviewed later after things had kind of calmed down, right?
Yes.
Now, at any time during those first few hours after you arrived at the hospital, did you learn that Ty had not been shot?
Yes, I know I repeatedly did ask that first officer if Ty was in there, is that Tai Chan in there, is that Tai Chan in there? And eventually she told me no, it was not Tai Chan.
Okay. And as a result of learning that it wasn't Ty, did you relay that information to anybody else?
I believe that I talked to Leah about it and told her that it wasn't Ty.
Okay. The police officers asked you to come back to the station to give a more detailed statement, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that was after you had a little bit of a chance to calm down and compose yourself?
Yes.
Okay. Do you ever remember during when Ty and Jeremy were kind of arguing, do you ever remember an exchange where Ty asked, "Are we cool?"
Yes.
Okay, explain to the jury how that conversation came about and with the exchange between Mr. Martin and Mr. Chan.
I don't know how it came about. Again, I wasn't really hanging around them, but I do recall seeing it happen, and it was Tai Chan saying, basically, "Hey man, are we cool? Are we cool?" Trying to really, in my opinion, try to calm things down, squash whatever was going on, and Jeremy's saying, "I think I'm pretty cool." Obviously still agitated about something, saying, I'm pretty cool. I don't know about you. I'm pretty cool.
Okay.
Something in that manner.
And did it escalate farther than that? Or that was
That's all that I don't believe it escalated any further than that.
And do you remember when you were talking to the police that relaying to the police officers that Mr. Martin was definitely upset with Ty?
Yes.
Okay. And tell the jury in what context, if best you can.
But I guess
how he was acting upset. What made you believe he was upset?
Well, it was like that event right there. I could tell that he was still upset with Ty about something.
Okay.
I don't know how else to describe that.
And do you remember the police officers telling the police officer that maybe Ty was saying something a little bit insensitive to him?
At the time of when he said, "Are we cool?" or
at any time over the evening, do you recall telling the police officer that maybe Ty was being somewhat insensitive?
I don't recall that.
If I showed you in your statement where you told the police that Ty was being insensitive, would maybe that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Okay. On page.
Mr. Clark, you're asking that question the right way.
Yeah, I am. Looking at page 8 of 34. 8 of 34.
It's right here.
Okay, yeah. All right, having had the opportunity to refresh your recollection, do you remember talking to the police about saying that Ty was being insensitive?
Yes.
Okay.
That is certainly a better recollection than I have today. So.
Okay. And what, if anything, do you remember about what Ty might have been saying that was insensitive?
I don't know. I don't recall.
Okay. And do you remember telling the police that when you got the phone call from Leah that you were screaming and crying because you thought your friend was dead?
It wasn't when I got the phone call from Leah. It was when it was on the drive over when I had heard the police scanner radio. That's when I started getting very upset.
And do you remember telling the police that your impression of Jeremy was he was kind of an ass and kind of a jerk?
Yes.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Rourke.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Cross-examination is recessed on.
So it's Dr. Sexauer now, right?
Yes.
You know that we talked on one prior occasion, correct?
Correct.
And that was in the district attorney's office, right? Okay. Now, just to clarify, and I appreciated your answer, what is your actual position with New Mexico State?
Well, I currently don't have one. Their term positions, they go throughout the semester, so the semester ends, and then I no longer have the position. I believe my last, the last title of my position was assistant professor.
Okay, very good. Now, sir, you indicated you recalled speaking with Detective Rudy Sanchez
Yes.
at the Las Cruces Police Department. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Now, during the course of that, do you recall telling him that at some point in time that Jeremy Martin switched over to water and was no longer drinking alcohol?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in the context of that evening, I believe you said you arrived there at approximately what time?
I would say maybe 9:15. Again, it's probably in the statement and it's a lot more accurate than that, but
Okay. But at what point in time did Jeremy Martin switch from drinking alcohol over to drinking water?
I could never get a good estimate of that, I don't think.
Okay. Now, you do recall that there were, what, 2 rounds of fireballs that everybody had, correct?
Yes.
Including yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And just so we'll have a record, what is a fireball?
It's a whiskey, I believe.
Okay. And how big were the shots?
Seemed like regular sized shots. I don't.
Okay. Were they served in a shot glass?
Yes.
Now, after that, do you recall seeing Jeremy Martin consume any other alcohol?
No.
Do you recall seeing Tai Chan consume any additional alcohol?
Yes.
Do you know what he was drinking?
I don't recall, but I just saw it in my statement over here that it was possibly Red Bull and vodka or something like that.
And do you remember approximately how many Red Bull and vodkas that you saw him drink that after he started drinking, he switched drinks from Fireball to that?
Again, as I wasn't really with them much, I do remember seeing him with at least one. I don't know any more beyond that.
Okay. Now, I recall you saying that Dublin's isn't your favorite place, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a reason why it's not your favorite place?
Mostly just because I feel like the service isn't great.
Okay. But you decided to go to Dublin's. You wanted to spend some time with your good friend Tai Chan, correct?
Yes.
Now, you said you reunited with him in college at New Mexico State. Is that correct?
Correct.
Were you living on the same floor? Were you in the same fraternity? Would you please
When we
describe-
first got to New Mexico State,
Yeah.
I don't know where. I think he may have moved into the fraternity house. I don't know. We didn't live near each other then.
Okay. Well, how did you get to know him again?
We both joined the same fraternity.
Okay. Did you live in the same location once you joined the fraternity?
He joined before I did, about at least a year and a half before I did. So we lived together after my first semester, so my third year in school, our junior year.
Okay. And where did the two of you live after you joined the fraternity?
Casa Bandera Apartments?
Did you live in the same apartment with him?
Yes.
And for what length of time were you roommates?
1 year.
Now, after that 1 year, did you graduate?
Me? No.
Did he graduate?
No.
Did you continue to maintain a close friendship after that?
Yes.
Were both of you still at New Mexico State at that time?
Yes.
Okay. Did you live after that, after you were roommates, did you live in the same complex or in close proximity to each other after that?
Yes.
Where was that place?
At Casa Bandera. I moved to a different apartment and he stayed in that apartment.
Okay. And you remained good friends?
Yes.
And that friendship continued on
Yes.
over the years. Did you maintain contact with him all the way up to October the 27th of 2014?
What do you mean?
Did you maintain close contact with him by phone calls or?
Yes, yes. He lived in Santa Fe. I still lived here. Whenever I'd go up there, I would see him just about every time.
Okay. And do you have any recollection before October the 27th of him coming down here, spending time with you?
Yes.
Now, before October 27th, I believe you indicated you really didn't know Leah Tafoya at all.
No.
Had you ever seen her before, to the best of your knowledge?
I believe that I had been introduced to her once. Didn't say more than hello.
Okay. Now, during the course of your interview with Detective Sanchez, did you indicate to him that you'd seen worse arguments over the football game than what you saw between Ty Chan and Jeremy Martin?
After reading it a couple days ago, I believe that I said around the beginning that I'd seen millions of, like I had seen this millions of times before from millions of different people, something like that.
Okay. Now, as the evening progressed, there was no physical confrontation at all.
No.
No pushing?
None that I saw.
Okay. No pushing or shoving,
No.
anything that you saw?
No.
Did you ever hear them yelling at each other?
Yeah, they had raised voices. I don't know if I would quite call it yelling, but yes, they had raised voices.
And where were they when that occurred?
I don't recall. Not at the table, if I remember correctly. They weren't at the table, but I don't exactly remember where they were.
Okay. Could you hear what exactly was being said?
Not exactly.
Could you hear any of it?
I thought I remember hearing Ty say something like, I'm a good person.
Okay. Did you hear any response from Jeremy?
No.
Now, during the course of the evening, even though you saw them arguing, would they then appear to be friendly and okay with each other?
Yes.
And how were you able to tell that?
They had calmed down and they weren't arguing anymore.
Okay. And for what length of time, let's say after the first time you saw them arguing, were they close, friendly, and everything was cool?
I guess I would say that the time that I remember them I had calmed down and being okay was when we were leaving. I don't remember other times where it was like up and down between that.
Okay. But when you left, everything was fine.
Yes.
Noticed nothing unusual between the two of them at all?
No.
Okay. Where were they sitting when you were leaving?
I can't exactly recall, but I would imagine the table that we were at when we got there.
Now, what time was it when you left?
Again, it's probably in my statement as a better estimation, but probably around 11 or 11:15, 11:30.
Okay. Now, how did you get home?
Ian Robles.
Did anybody else leave at the same time you and Ian left?
Not that I'm aware of.
I have just one moment.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Work.
No further questions at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Clark?
No.
Redirect examination.
No, sir, no questions.
Does the jury have any questions of Dr. Setzoff? Let me ask the attorneys to approach the bench. Dr. Sexhauer, the jury has questions of you. Do you know how Mrs. Foya Chan got your cell number if you had only met once before?
The night of, I did not know, but I'm sorry, very loud.
That's
I found out later that she had gotten it from Ty's iPad, I believe, at his house. I know the detective asked me the same question, so I tried to figure it out, and I did inform the detectives of that the next day.
Right, you had testified during your, I believe, your direct examination that your impression of Mr. Martin was, I believe that you used the term ass. Was that, did you arrive at that impression before you were at the bar, or while you were at the bar, or after you became aware of the shooting?
Again, I mean, I feel so bad. I only said a few words to him, so I feel bad about coming to that conclusion. But it was absolutely before I had heard about the shooting. It was from the second I met him, and he was saying that stuff about Ty through the evening when he seemed really just upset with Ty and just seemed just not that fun. So I mean, ass almost seems too harsh. Just not, someone I probably would hang out with again.
Right. Does the jury have any further questions? May this witness be excused? Mr. Clark?
Yes, sir. Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Dr. Sexhauer, thank you very much. With your excusal, you have no further responsibilities to this trial. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon. Mr. Clark or Mr. Day, the next witness.
Dr. Michael Spence.
Dr. Spence, good afternoon. Before you take your seat, let me ask you to please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of law?
I do.
Thank you. Go ahead and take your seat. Come up to the microphone. And again, for our record, would you please give us your full and complete name and the spelling of your last name?
Yes, my name is Dr. Michael Joseph Spence. That's S-P-E-N-C-E.
All right, thank you. Mr. Clark, you can begin us with your direct examination of Dr. Spence.
Thank you. Dr. Spence, what's your educational background?
I obtained a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from UT El Paso. Both of those were in microbiology. I then moved on to achieve a PhD in molecular biology from New Mexico State University.
And for your PhD, were you required to write a scholarly peer-reviewed publication?
Yes, I had to write essentially a book on a gene that I cloned and some characterization of that, regulation of that gene.
What did you do after you completed your PhD?
I moved on to the University of Vermont Medical School, where I took a postdoctoral research position, moving more into cancer research related areas.
As part of your research, how many peer-reviewed scientific articles have you published?
14.
As a forensic DNA expert, do you have any published articles?
Yes, I worked on an article with a couple of other authors that was published in early 2015. It was published in a, not a peer-reviewed journal, but a journal called The Champion, and it's reviewed by attorneys, so it's a legal publication. and that related to a criminal case that I was involved in 2013 in the state of Texas.
And how do you go, doctor, from cancer research to forensic DNA casework?
Well, there was a little step left out there. I moved on to Boise, Idaho, where I worked for 8 years in cancer research at the Boise VA Medical Center. After about 8 years of continued research in that area, I was interested in new things, and I knew what was going on with CSI and DNA and all of that, so I started putting out feelers and found a position with the Indiana State Police. They hired me in May of 2003 and assigned me to their Evansville Regional Lab.
And what specialized training, if any, did you receive from the Indiana State Police?
Well, I came in very knowledgeable about the DNA, but I knew nothing about how things work in a crime lab, so I needed to learn how evidence came into crime labs and what the forensic biologists do in those crime labs, which is to check out evidence and look for body fluids on various types of items. Once it moves on beyond identifying places where the DNA might be on whatever kind of evidence, the DNA work is similar to research in that you're extracting DNA, you quantify how much DNA you get from each item, and then it moves on to the human identification typing that is done in crime labs, comparisons between known samples and question samples, and then writing all of that up properly into a report.
And how long did you work for the Indiana State Police? And within that question, how many criminal cases did you work on?
I worked just over 100 cases over a period of 4 years, from May 2003 to May 2007.
Okay. And what did you do when you left your position with the Indiana State Police?
Well, I was getting pretty homesick for New Mexico, and I had a position back here at a laboratory located on the campus of New Mexico State University that would bring me into a position where I'd be a technical manager for a startup lab that would do forensic biology testing. So I moved back from Indiana to Las Cruces, New Mexico.
All right. And at some point in time, did you leave that laboratory job and take another position?
Yes, I was in that laboratory for about 8 months, from May of 07 until February of 08. And I didn't so much take another position, I started a consulting company. That company is Spence Forensic Resources, and I'm located still right here in Las Cruces, New Mexico.
And Dr. Spence, what services do you offer as a consultant?
Well, my door's open to anybody who needs any kind of consulting relating to criminal case investigations, the forensic biology part of it. It can be prosecutors who, I still haven't gotten a phone call from a prosecutor to bring a case to me, but I do get a lot of public defense cases, not just out of New Mexico, but elsewhere. And what I do is I explain the DNA reports and all of the supporting documents to them. Sometimes those things get a little bit overly scientific and difficult to understand. Your colleagues' work, and this is called peer review. So I did about 230, 235 of those, but right now I'm up over 750 case reviews because I've done quite a bit of review in the last 8 years, since February of 08. Another 530 or so cases.
So is it accurate, Doctor, that you've reviewed cases for both, and this is including your work with the Indiana State Police, for both law enforcement and defense counsel, or for defendants?
Yes, that's correct.
Are there any sorts of checks and balances to monitor your work?
Yeah, there are. I don't have to achieve some kind of license or maintain any kind of accreditation as a forensic consultant in DNA, but the checks and balances are right here in front of you. Sometimes, on about 10% of my cases, I do need to testify, and there is an opposing scientist who has done the work for the prosecution in the instances where I'm testifying for the defense, and there's other experts out there that could be brought in to check and balance any reports that I release or any testimony that I offer.
All right. And Dr. Spence, do you work for free?
No, I don't.
Tell the jury, if you will, what your fees are.
My fees are currently $280 per hour. Sometimes I work for a little bit less than that for certain entities. Occasionally I take a case for free.
All right. Now, as a consultant, do you currently do any wet work or lab work, or is it review of documentation from other people's lab work?
For the last 8+ years, it's been strictly documentation that I look at. I don't do any more hands-on work since February of 2008.
How many different labs do you work with from over the country? I mean, let's see. I'm sorry, let me retract that question. As part of your work, have you ever been qualified as an expert in the area of DNA forensic science?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury, including your work in Indiana?
As far as qualifying for testimony, well, this is the 72nd time I've been on the witness stand. The first 16 were all for the prosecution with the Indiana State Police. The other 55 and now 56 has been for the defense. And I've been qualified to testify on forensic biology, biological fluid identification, DNA typing, mixture analysis of DNA, DNA, we call DNA transfer events, those types of areas, sub-areas of the whole science.
And those qualifications, have they been in New Mexico?
Sometimes yes, but I've testified in a lot of states. I'm starting to lose track.
Tell the jury some other states you've been qualified in courts to testify as an expert.
I've testified in both federal and state court in Arizona, state court in Texas many times, a lot of times here in New Mexico in both federal and state. Colorado, I've testified there. I testified for the first time in Florida this year. Testified in Michigan, a couple times in Maryland, and I don't think I'm forgetting any.
All right. And have you ever been qualified to testify in specialized forensic DNA, in any specialized forensic DNA area?
Yeah, those areas that I just mentioned. Sometimes there are certain aspects of the case that need to be illuminated, such as DNA transfer events, mixture analysis of when you test an item and you see more than one person on the item. Sometimes there's what's called YSTR testing, which is Y chromosome-based testing. So that's just looking for male DNA.
Your Honor, at this time I would offer Dr. Michael Spence as an expert in the area of DNA testing and forensic DNA testing.
Mr. Rourke, is this your witness? Mr. Prindle, is this your witness?
Yes, Mr. Logan.
Do you have any objection?
No.
Then the court is going to designate Dr. Spence as an expert in forensic DNA analysis.
All right, Dr. Spence, as part of your work in this case, did you review case notes from DNA specialist from Department of Public Safety?
Yes, I did. I reviewed a case report and then the supporting documents for that report.
Okay. And in that review, that included about a dozen objects?
Yes.
Okay. And then you recently received, as of a few hours ago, a second report from that lab as well, right?
Yes, I received a report, a one-page report today that was released today, showing analysis of 4 additional items.
All right. And it was from the same DNA analyst, correct?
Yes.
And what's that person's name?
It's hard to pronounce, but the last name is Kiermaier.
So do you have in front of you the February of 2015 report?
Yes, I do.
Okay, can you take that out?
Yes, I have that right here.
Okay, so I direct you to a blood test on a result, item 16. Can you tell the jury what item 16 was?
Yes, item 16 was is listed here as handgun.
Okay, and were you able to review the report regarding the handgun?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Were you able to review Ms. Kiermaier's report and what was contained in the report regarding the handgun?
Yes.
And were you able to review her report regarding the handgun? There was no blood detected on the handgun.
Yes, at the bottom of the page it lists serology results and it does say no blood was detected on item 16.
And can you comment to the jury on how Ms. Camere would have arrived at this result?
In part, there are analyst bench notes that show that same item and notes on how that item was taken out and what was done with it. And I also attended testimony on Tuesday that gave me further information about how that item was analyzed, at least in that context, looking for blood.
So you were present during Ms. Camere's testimony?
Yes, on Tuesday.
All right. And the bench notes, tell the jury what the bench notes are.
The bench notes are a worksheet that comes with what they might call the serology part of the analysis. I prefer evidence examination. So they're taking a package and they're of any sort in any case. They're going to cut open the paper sack is usually what it is because it's sealed, and they take the item out and they begin describing what they see on the item.
And do the bench notes reveal what Ms. Camere did as far as examining the item number 16, the Glock handgun for blood?
Yes, if you want me to describe that.
Yep. Please describe.
Part of what she did was she collected, and it's based on the bench notes, was she collected a swab from 4 areas of the firearm, and that would be the trigger guard, the grip, and then there's a slide mechanism that was also included, all in one swab. And then she noted that there were no reddish brown blood-like stains on I suppose either the swab or the gun.
Okay. And you were present during one of the jurors' questions about the possibility of there having been blood on the gun but having been burned off. Do you have any comment, or do you recall that question posed by the court?
Yes, and I should point out I heard all of her testimony, and there was another swab that was collected from the gun.
Okay.
I kind of paused there, but she did testify that she took another swab from the muzzle area. There was questions about possible blowback blood, if there was any on the firearm, and she testified that on the tip end of the gun and even inside the barrel she had taken a swab, and it was negative for blood.
Okay. And do you have any disagreements with Ms. Camere about the presence of blood or the absence of blood, or are you generally satisfied with her conclusions?
Once I heard the testimony, it was clear that she could not see any kind of evidence of any blood on that firearm. Any of those areas that were eventually tested for DNA, or the area on the end of the muzzle, she could see no discolorations, and her typing information gave no indication of blood.
And you have no dispute with those findings, correct?
No.
Okay. But Ms. Camere did offer testimony regarding the possibility that blood could have been burned off, or I don't. You remember that? You recall that testimony, correct?
Yes, and you just asked something about a juror question, and that's when it came out that there was a question about possible, maybe there was some blood on the muzzle, but it got burned off by the heat of subsequent rounds that were fired off.
And you heard that testimony, and you do have some disagreement with her answer, correct?
Yes, the answer appeared to be that that was a clear possibility that it could have been burned off, but I have to disagree with that.
And first of all, that requires speculation on the part of Ms. Camere, right?
Very much so,
Okay.
yes.
And then setting aside the speculation for a moment, explain to the jury why you have some disagreement with her answer.
Well, the blood test that is used to determine either the presence or absence of blood, I can abbreviate the name to phenol, because Ms. Camere refers to it as that. It's a longer name that I won't burden everyone with. But the phenol test is very sensitive, and it can be sensitive to extremely high temperatures, but not, from my research that I've looked at over a period of years and recent months, the kind of temperatures you get from a gun heating up, even from firing off an entire magazine, is not likely to completely obliterate all the blood on a muzzle of a gun.
Okay. And so I guess I'd be asking you to in light of her testimony, in light of her original findings that there was no blood on the gun, what would your conclusion be regarding the presence of blood on that gun?
Well, I trust her report that says there's no blood detected on the firearm.
And even given the hypothetical and the speculation by the juror question, would your conclusion still be no blood on the firearm?
Yeah, there was no foundation to assume that there might have been some blood that was obliterated by repeated firing of the gun. To me, there's no scientific foundation for that at all whatsoever.
All right. Also during her testimony, you heard that there was a question about fingerprinting and such, correct? Remember
Yes.
that? And there was a question, I guess she mentioned that an examination of the handgun by a fingerprint analyst could have easily compromised the detection of blood and DNA. Do you have any comment on her answer to that question?
Yes, I think that the question was fine about a latent print examiner, and in the notes that Ms. Kiermere accumulated when looking at the firearm, one of the first things she said that she noted markings from a latent print examiner. And later in the notes, she referred to a pinkish residue that was on the firearm. Also, I believe in parentheses, she said that might have been from latent print examination. And I agree that this is not good. A firearm like this should not go to the latent print examiner first, and then to a DNA expert second. There could be a very important latent print on a firearm. If there is, and there's a request also for DNA, these analysts should definitely be looking at it simultaneously, and the DNA person should be collecting a swab to look for blood, DNA, handling DNA, while making sure not to damage any latent prints, and vice versa. The latent print person certainly shouldn't be handling it first, and then it just shows up in the hands of the analyst, and from the notes it appeared that she just received it and noted latent print examiner markings on the box. And this is a breach in protocol. If it's not in their SOPs, it should be. You can't do that.
All right, but let me ask you this though, based on a review of Ms. Kiermere's bench notes, is there any indication from your review of the notes and your review of the findings that in fact anything was done to compromise the DNA testing?
Well, the DNA results were obtained, so maybe they weren't completely compromised, because we did see profiles. We saw a mixture profile on the firearm, so maybe not, but it was a potentially dangerous, disastrous situation to have a latent print person looking at it first. It could have compromised the DNA, but there's reason to believe that didn't happen.
And you're saying it didn't happen because DNA samples were arrived at, DNA samples were discovered, and DNA profiles were achieved?
Yes, there may have been some compromising, but at least results were achieved, and so the gun wasn't somehow wiped clean or compromised by really a contaminating agent, some kind of a residue that was used to detect latent prints, and that's fortunate that it went that way.
Okay, from a review of the bench notes, are you aware of the areas of the gun or the firearm that were swabbed for DNA?
Yes, and as I said, for the actual DNA typing, that was the swab that I mentioned. It was encompassed all of those areas: the trigger guard, the grip, and the slide mechanism were all swabbed off. That swab was consumed for the purpose of DNA testing.
And did you agree with Ms. Kiermere's recitation of her testimony that you would typically swab for DNA in places where DNA would most likely be deposited or left behind?
Well, in the instance of that swab, that's where you would most likely get handling DNA of a firearm or any kind of object that's got handles on it. You're going to look in those places where you would normally touch it.
And from her report about the swab, from the places you would normally touch it, what did the report from the swabbing tell us? What do we know from her report? From her report,
Ms. Kiermere reported that there was a mixture detected of at least 2 individuals, and it is what we call a major-minor mixture.
Okay. And who was the major contributor?
The major contributor was Tai Chan.
And is there anything surprising about the major contributor on this Glock handgun being Tai Chan?
No. Knowing everyone stipulating this was his firearm, you would expect that he's going to be the major contributor, and he certainly was.
Okay. Let's talk for a moment about the minor profile.
Okay.
Right. Now tell the jury, if you will, what a minor profile is.
A minor profile is going to be a profile that you can distinguish from another person's profile, especially when you have knowns to compare. And with the stronger signals that showed up on the DNA data matching Tai Chan, then the remaining signals were looked at. And there were quite a few. There were at least 27 and some lower level hints of possible signals, but 27 clear, what we call alleles were called.
I'm going to ask you to explain about alleles a little bit more in a moment.
Okay.
But I think Dr. Kamir talked about maybe that our DNA being like our social security number. It's our DNA is unique to each one of us, right?
Yes, unless there's an identical twin.
And do you have any reason to believe there's identical twins in this situation?
No.
Okay. And when you talk about a known profile, from a review of the bench notes and the report, there were DNA profiles for both Ty Chan and Jeremy Martin, correct?
Yes, there were known standards that were collected and typed.
And a known standard is a DNA sample taken from a certain individual, whether it's me, or whether it's Mr. Chan, or whether it's Mr. Martin, and so you have something to work against. You have a known, right?
That's what you use for your comparisons, yes.
Okay. So and what did that minor sample? What did Ms. Kamir? What did that minor sample indicate, or the minor contributor indicate?
When she noted the presence of a minor contributor and she conducted a comparison to Jeremy Martin, she ruled that you could not exclude Jeremy Martin as a potential contributor to the mixture or to this minor profile.
All right. So, to say the least, I find these DNA percentages confusing. So can you please explain to the jury what those numbers mean in lay terms from the standpoint of Ms. Kamir's report about Jeremy Martin's minor profile?
Okay, well, the one thing that I haven't talked about, but that was discussed on Tuesday, was that anytime you say a person cannot be excluded as a possible contributor to something, you can't leave it just at that. You have to do a calculation for population statistics. And she did 5 calculations for different population groups.
And why would there only be 5? Are there only 5 population groups in the world?
No, there's an undefined number of population groups, but the forensic biologists try to break it down to groups that are typical of the area where the case took place.
And in this case, what would those 5 population groups be?
There's African American, Apache, Caucasian, Navajo, and Southwest Hispanic.
All right. And so in this situation, what was the conclusion reached by Ms. Kamir regarding the minor profile and Jeremy Martin?
Well, the conclusion that we work with here, the basic protocol is to go with the lowest number. And this is the most conservative way to present this to anyone. Often in a case like this with a firearm, it may be a firearm, let's just say, for example, from an armed robbery, and we want to see, is the defendant's DNA on this firearm? Well, if you get a number like 1 in 6,900, that's a very low number, and that means that person's DNA and maybe a lot of other people in the world might have been contributors. But if it's 1 in a billion, then it's a very unique profile, and it probably is that person. But we don't have a number that big. We have bigger numbers than the one we've been working with here, which is 1 in 6,900. So that's kind of the number that we normally work with, is the most conservative number. So just working with the locations that we're typing the DNA on, we interpret it in the most conservative possible fashion, and we use the most conservative number on here. But in this instance, the roles are a little bit reversed as to how we apply these numbers to looking at what's on this particular firearm, because we're not looking at the firearm to implicate the defendant. We're looking at the firearm to see if somebody else's DNA who may have been at the scene is there. So the roles get a little bit reversed there in this instance.
But in this situation, you know from the police reports that Jeremy Martin was present in the room, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So tell the jury, if you will, what this 1 in 6,900 estimation suggests in this case. So how does that 1 in 6,900 statistic work?
Okay, what that means is theoretically, it's an estimate, that if you were to take, and this is the number taken from the Caucasian group, and you shouldn't read too much into which group is picked, it's just the lowest number. But if you were to gather together 6,900 Caucasian individuals, the estimation would be that one of those 6,900 people would have similar allelic information, genetic information to Jeremy Martin or what's on that minor profile. The other 6,899 people would be flat out excluded as being possible contributors. So that's what that number is telling us. Some of the bigger numbers are less conservative, and you'd have to look at a lot more people to find somebody who has similar data to what we see on the firearm that is consistent with Jeremy Martin and the minor alleles.
But just using the smallest number, the Caucasian population, out of 6,900 people in a room or in any one location, 6,899 would be excluded, and there would be one with a similar DNA profile.
Yes, that's the prediction that these statistics are trying to lay out there to put weight on the likelihood that this person's DNA is there.
Okay. Now, and you, in addition to the DNA reports, you had the opportunity to review some police reports in this case, have you not? And you,
yes.
And we've communicated some facts back and forth together with you and I, correct?
Yes.
And does that 6,900 number, that 1 in 6,900 number, does that become does it change or become less or more likely, given the fact that you know Jeremy Martin was in the room when with the handgun or in this situation?
It does logically play a role in this, because we have to take into account how many people had access to this gun that evening or in recent period of time prior to that evening. And one would think that it's going to be a limited number of people. And yes, by all accounts, there were only 2 people involved in this incident. And one of them happens to be somebody with very similar DNA to what's found in the minor profile.
And that's the minor profile of Jeremy Martin?
Yes, 27 of his 29 alleles were recognized within that minor profile.
Okay, so I guess now's the time more than any to talk about what is an allele.
An allele is a version of the genetic material that we're testing when we do this human identification process that gives us that barcode that Ms. Kumir referred to, and that's a good description. When we look at, in this case, for example, 15 genetic locations, you're going to have a number corresponding to each of those locations, but actually a second number as well, because we get a number from our mother, we get a number from our father. Sometimes those numbers are identical, so you only get one version of this genetic material at that place. In this case, if you count all the numbered code that corresponds to Jeremy Martin from his known profile, there's 29 markers that define him. And it's not going to be those same 29 markers from anybody on the planet unless he had an identical twin. And 27 of those 29 are there within the profile.
Okay. Now, I believe we heard yesterday from Ms. Kumir on Tuesday that the world population is over 7 billion, right?
Yes.
But we also heard a statistic that that to eliminate somebody or include them, you're looking at a statistical number of 1 in 300 million, right?
Yes, it's 300 billion.
I'm sorry, 300 billion. That seems somewhat absurd mathematically. What does all this mean from the math? What are we talking about?
Well, it happens to be the same number that was arrived at with the Indiana State Police. Their supervisors and management decided on the same number. And I once asked the technical leader where they arrived at that number, and it's 1,000 times the population of the United States. So we're about 300 million. 300 billion is our population. They figure if you get a stat that high, they'll call that a match. That's good enough, which is a little bit outrageous because there are only 7.4 billion people on the whole planet using that criteria. They're being very conservative before they say this is a scientific certainty, this is a match, this is what we call a single source attribution.
And does the FBI have any standards that are used, or are there national standards for DNA testing?
Yes.
And to the best of your knowledge, are these national standards, these FBI standards, employed by the Department of Public Safety, the crime lab?
Yeah, I believe that they're embraced by just about every lab that, on any of the cases that I've examined, they're at least following the guidelines. I think it's better to use that term, guidelines. These labs are all subjected to accreditation and audits. to make sure that they're compliant with guidelines such as those put out by the FBI.
Okay. Now, are you familiar from your review of the case notes or any of the materials you've received of any search by the state in any capacity for someone who knew Tai Chan who might have DNA that was similar to Jeremy Martin?
No, I didn't see anything to that effect, and there were no standards collected other than Tai Chan and Jeremy Martin.
All right, let me refer you to, or have you look at item 46. That was the broken wristwatch.
Yes, it was.
All right. Now, were you able to review the findings regarding the broken wristwatch?
Yes, I was.
All right. And tell the jury, if you will, what finding, if you agree with the findings of Ms. Kamir regarding the statistical analysis regarding the wristwatch.
Yes, there was nothing unusual about her findings. She reported that she saw a mixture of at least 3 individuals, and to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. The major portion of that mixture was attributable to Tai Chan.
And did that surprise you, given the fact that this was Ty's wristwatch?
No, there's no surprise there at all.
So let's talk about then the results themselves. So there was a certain amount of DNA recovered, right?
Yes, there was 2.4 nanograms were recovered from this complete swabbing of the entire wristwatch.
And there were 2 or more contributors, correct? To the
There
DNA?
were 3, at least 3.
At least 3. And if you could tell the jury what the results were, and then I'll have some more questions for you.
Well, in addition to the source attribution to Tai Chan as being the major among the minor alleles that were observed, she could not eliminate Jeremy Martin as being a possible contributor to that mixture.
And as we've already talked about, it's not surprising that Tai Chan is the major donor or major contributor because it was his watch, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, the statistics for the wristwatch are different from the statistics on the gun, correct?
Yes. So
Okay.
once again, you can't say somebody cannot be excluded without putting some kind of number on that.
All right. And does it, in your opinion, does that difference have anything to do with the number of possible contributors to the DNA on the watch?
Very much so. There were 12 alleles. There were 12 code numbers on there within the minor alleles that could not have come from Jeremy Martin or Tai Chan. So it's unknown who that person or persons were.
And so the other contributors are unknown, correct?
Exactly.
They didn't match, those other contributors could not be matched to the known samples either to Tai or to Jeremy, right?
Yeah, they're what I would call unaccounted for alleles. They could not have come from the 2 people who were typed here, Tai Chan and Jeremy Martin. They had to be from somebody else.
All right. But Jeremy Martin couldn't be excluded as one of the contributors on the watch as well, correct?
That's correct, and that's because instead of 27 of his 29 alleles, there was actually 28 of his 29 alleles on the watch.
All right. Now, as with the statistical number on the handgun, it was 1 in 6,900. On the watch, tell the jury what the statistical analysis was for the watch.
The statistical analysis on there were several numbers generated, but the lowest, which we have to go with the most conservative estimate, was for Caucasian population. 1 out of every 110 Caucasians would be a possible contributor to that. Random people.
So by the same example, if we moved 110 people into a room, 109 would be excluded, and there would be 1 with the DNA profile matching the minor contributor found on the watch.
Yes, matching or at least similar, that you wouldn't be able to exclude their inclusion.
Okay. Now, can you draw any conclusions between the DNA sample of the minor contributor on the watch and the DNA sample, the minor DNA sample from the contributor on the gun, and draw any comparisons between those 2 samples?
Yes, they're going to be similar because, as I've already stated, off of the firearm, the minor alleles for the most part were 27 added alleles, and they were all consistent with Jeremy Martin. 28 of 29 of those alleles on the watch were consistent with Jeremy Martin. So there's parallels here in the DNA, the minor DNA profiles on those two items.
Parallels on the minor contributor on the DNA on the gun and on the watch. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Dr. Spence, did you, other than the handgun and the watch, did you draw any other conclusions based on the DNA report that was given to you, as well as the bench notes?
The only thing I would say is that this report covered 13 items that were looked at, the watch and the handgun being 2 of them, and there were a number of other items, many of them being blood positives, presumptive blood positives, and many of those were single source attributed to one of the 2 people who were typed in this case.
And when we talk about single source, that means I think if I know this right, that means there was no minor contributor. It was a single source of DNA, whether it was the blood on the wall or the blood on the pillowcase or the blood on the sheet, right?
Yeah, that there was no mixture in most of those. There was one with a very, very weak mixture. I can't remember which item that was. I could look at that, but yeah, most of those were single source and no evidence of a mixture on those.
And let me ask you specifically to reference the doctor's report, or Ms. Kamir's report on the pillowcase that's been admitted into evidence. There was single source DNA on that pillowcase, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that single source was Tai Chan, right?
Yes, it was determined to be presumptively blood, and it was single source to Tai Chan, and that would be item number 44 for Ms. Kirmir.
And then item number 45 was the second pillowcase?
That's correct.
And that also was presumption of blood and single source, and that was Tai Chan?
That's correct.
And then we have 46, I believe, is the sheet.
Yeah, it's a bed sheet, yes.
Okay, and same thing, single source, single contributor, and that was also Tai Chan?
I'm sorry, I got to back up a little bit. Did you say item 52 is the bed sheet?
No, you
Sorry.
tell me what the number is.
Yeah, 46 was a watch, and we went 44, 45. Both of those are pillowcases, yeah. Item number 52 is the bed sheet. And yes, that was a presumptive blood positive, and it did type as a single source to Tai Chan.
Now, shifting gears for a second, because you just got the report dated June 2nd, and you have that with you, correct?
Yes, I did receive a report just today.
And looking at that report, there is an item on there that was tested.
Yeah, there were a few items that were tested.
And I'm looking specifically at the item that's the white blanket.
Yes.
Okay, and what number is that on your sheet there?
On my sheet, the white blanket is listed as 0054.
And that's the item number?
Yes.
And that item number was tested just a few days ago, right?
Yeah, it was actually, the report was released today.
Okay. And that notes single source that was tested and was blood positive, correct?
Yeah, and there was actually sub-items of 0054A, 0054B, and 0054C, and these were 3 stains from that white blanket. And yes, they were all presumptive positive for blood, and they were all typed to single source. To a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, they were Tai Chan.
And that reasonable degree of scientific certainty is that 1 in 300 billion number?
Or beyond.
Or beyond. Now, when you have the subpart, A, B, and C, what does that mean to you?
What that means is from that blanket, and I witnessed seeing the blanket up on the overhead, that there's a fair amount of blood staining there. So 3 areas were selected by the analyst, and I don't know what those areas are because all I have is a one-page report, but she, I would assume, strategically picked 3 places and tested those.
And all of these samples, the pillowcases, the sheet, and the blanket, Jeremy Martin was excluded as a possible contributor for DNA on all 4 of those items, correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, pass the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr. Prindle, cross-examination of Dr. Spence.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Spence.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, you testified that you testified as an expert witness in approximately 70 criminal prosecutions, is that right? Or more?
I'm sorry, could you slow that down a little bit?
You testified that you have testified as an expert in approximately 60 or 70 criminal proceedings, is that correct, or is it more than that?
Actually 72, yeah.
Seven-
16 of those were for the prosecution with the Indiana State Police. The rest have been as a consultant.
Okay, and you also stated that approximately 55 of those expert testimonies were for the defense, is that accurate?
That's correct.
And is it still true, based on your resume, is that you've done about 23 trials in New Mexico, actual trials?
I wouldn't say that for certain, but I don't have it right here in front of me, but yes, it sounds about right.
And when you testified at those trials in New Mexico, did you testify for the defense or for the prosecution?
For all the cases in New Mexico, it has been for a defense team.
And Dr. Spence, when's the last time you did any actual work in a lab?
I have not done any work in a lab since February of 2008.
And is there any reason why you don't continue to do any work in the lab?
Well, things are going so well for consulting. This is what I'm doing now, and there's no lab here to work in. I'd have to move.
And your testimony today is based on your opinion of a report that was tendered by another person who conducted these tests. Is that true?
That's correct.
But you haven't conducted any independent tests yourself.
No, I have not.
So it's solely based on your opinion of this report.
Exactly. The report and the supporting documents, yes.
Supporting documents being notes, bench notes.
Yes, and I would add in that partly what I'm testifying to is what I've viewed as attending this trial.
Dr. Spence, would you agree that there are many ways in which DNA can be transferred?
Yes.
For example, I think when we think of the transfer of DNA, we think of bodily fluids like blood, saliva, semen. Is that accurate?
Yes, those are very rich sources of DNA.
But there are also other sources, aren't there?
Yes.
Isn't it true that DNA can be transferred by other means as simple as just coming in contact with another person, or a person coming in contact with an item, even touching that item?
Yes, because there are skin cells on your body. Any part that touches, there can be a transfer event in that instance. Yes.
So that is a distinct possibility.
Yes.
Dr. Spence, have you heard or used the term secondary transfer?
Yes, I have.
Could you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that term means?
Yes, a primary transfer, for example, would just be me touching something and putting my DNA on it. If somebody comes along and wipes that off, maybe they're cleaning the area, my DNA might end up on that rag. No, I never touched the rag, but my DNA ended up on it by secondary transfer event.
Okay. So there's many ways that someone's DNA could be transferred or found on an item. Is that true?
That's true.
And Dr. Spence, isn't there is a significant difference between the source of a major DNA profile and someone who simply cannot be eliminated? Isn't there a significant difference between those two?
There's a difference, yes.
How significant?
Well, it's kind of hard to put a finger on that. You know, when you have a single source profile and the statistics calculate that you have to look at 300 billion or more people to find somebody else with that, that's an outrageous number, but it's actually not a bad, it's a reasonable estimate. When you have numbers that are down in the thousands or higher or a little lower, that's an indication that the profile just isn't as strong and that there might be other minor alleles mixed in there that make these calculations reasonably accurate.
But there is a difference, hence the use of the two distinct terms.
Yes.
You did review the report that you mentioned in your direct examination, and we talked about item number 16 being the handgun,
Yes, sir.
and there was an analysis done at the lab in Santa Fe by Ms. Sandra Kermer, who testified in this trial, and you testified that you essentially agreed with most of her protocol that she followed and her findings, with a few exceptions. Is that accurate?
Yes, I didn't see any major problems with the protocol, especially once I heard her testify and clarify some more things, that I was fine with what she had to say.
And you did mention about, during direct examination, about the firearm itself. And you mentioned that although you didn't agree with the method she followed because it was examined for prints first, but she still was able to obtain a sample. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm going to try and follow what you said there. Are you talking about the latent print examination?
Well, you mentioned about, no, I'm talking about the examination of the firearm in general.
Yes.
You mentioned that you disagreed with the method that she followed because there was a latent print exam prior to the DNA analysis.
Actually, yeah, I would not put that so much on the analyst. As an analyst, when you open up an item, if the first thing that you note is that there's markings from an investigator who collected the item, but there's also another cut in the packaging, and it's been resealed and it's been initialed by a latent print examiner, which is what she noted in her notes. There's nothing she can do about that. This examination by a latent print examiner is probably most likely something that happened that she didn't even know that was going on. It was probably in another part of the lab. So you can't necessarily put that on the analyst as being responsible for somebody else checking out the item and checking it for latent prints before she ever got a chance to even get it into her hands.
I understand that, but the fact that that took place did not prevent her from obtaining a sample, a DNA sample or mixture from that firearm, did it?
I can't be certain how much it compromised the results, because I can't see the results that would have taken place if it had never been handled by a latent print examiner, because it was handled by a latent print examiner. What I can say is that across the country of the 60 or so laboratories where I've seen cases coming out, I've never heard of it being favorable to send it to latent prints first when there's a need to do DNA and send it to DNA afterward. This is not something that I think anybody has in their SOPs.
But still, you can't deny the fact that she was able to obtain a sample to compare with other profiles.
Yes, the genetic data was recovered from the sample anyway. Whether it would have been different if there hadn't been a latent print examiner in the middle there who shouldn't have been there, I can't say, but there were results that were obtained that were interpretable.
Okay. So referring back to item 16, the handgun, and you have a copy, I believe, of her report, and of course her analysis was that the DNA mixture of two or more individuals was obtained from item 16, and to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, Tai Chan is the source of the major DNA profile resolved from a mixture, and that Jeremy Martin cannot be eliminated, a possible contributor to a DNA mixture. In your testimony, you talked about major versus minor. So in this particular analysis, Tai Chan would have been a major contributor.
Yes.
And Jeremy Martin cannot be eliminated as a possible contributor. Is that the language that she uses?
That's pretty standard from what I see in most laboratories in the circumstances of what we call the E-grams that we look at. This is the actual DNA data. Her result there is reasonably worded.
And once again, going back to the transfer of DNA from one person to another or from a person to an object, you did testify that it can happen in many ways.
That it can happen in many ways?
ways.
Yes.
Dr. Spence, if two individuals were in a scuffle, this is a hypothetical situation, perhaps, and it was a physical confrontation, pushing, shoving, a scuffle, and it ended, maybe there was some punches thrown. Is it possible, if you did a DNA analysis of certain body parts of those individuals, there would have been a transfer from one to the other?
That's within the realm of possibilities, yes.
And how would that transfer have been accomplished? Would it simply by touching or physical contact with one body part from one person to another body part of another person? Is that possible?
Yes, your skin cells have DNA, as does blood and semen and saliva, as you mentioned earlier. Skin cells don't come off in the type of numbers you get in blood and semen and saliva, but still in high numbers. Especially, it depends on a lot of things. If there's friction, if there's sweating, if there's repeated actions, it's hard to pinpoint how much DNA, skin cells DNA would be transferred, but it's within the realm of possibilities you're going to get those transfer events, yes.
Okay, enough to become part of a mixture,
Yes.
which was what her analysis indicated in this case.
Yes. Just for example, if you test somebody's finger and you see a mixture, that could have been because they shook hands or they had a fight. It'd be hard to tell how, but you would know that there is a mixture there.
Okay, you mentioned the word how. If you did an analysis and you came up with this mixture, based on a hypothetical that I presented to you, is there any way of knowing how or when that transfer took place?
No, I believe Ms. Kiermaier testified to that the DNA typing is elegant and wonderful as it is, cannot tell us how the DNA came to be there or when it came to be there. It will never, as far as I know, be able to tell us that.
Okay, the hypothetical I just presented to you, I'm going to add one more hypothetical fact. What if two individuals got in a scuffle and one of the individuals had a hand, and they got in a scuffle or physical confrontation, there's pushing and shoving, maybe someone tries to push the gun away, a hypothetical situation. Could there possibly be a transfer of DNA to the handgun?
One of the individuals had the handgun and the other one didn't?
Yes.
And they get into the scuffle and then there's some contact with the handgun? Yes, there could be a transfer of DNA to the handgun.
Simply by touching or the handgun coming in contact with that individual is enough for a transfer, isn't that true?
It's at least potential, yes.
It's enough for that transfer, enough for DNA for it to show up in a mixture, isn't that true also?
Yes, it's difficult to retrace what could have happened, but those kind of scenarios that you're pointing out, those are potential situations where transfer events of skin cells which contain DNA can occur.
No, you talked about the watch, I think it was item 46. That watch belonged to Mr. Chan.
That's what I have been told.
Okay. And there was analysis, DNA analysis done on the watch also, and there was a similar result. I believe Mr. Chan was the major contributor, is that accurate?
That's true, yes.
And once again, Jeremy Martin could not be eliminated as a possible contributor, is that accurate also?
That is what the wording in the report says, and it's pretty standard based on the data that was gathered, if that was a reasonable reporting of what she found.
But it says possible contributor. It's not absolute.
No.
Same with the gun. A possible contributor, but not absolute.
No, the only thing that I would add to that is the number of alleles that are consistent with Mr. Martin that occur on the gun based on his total alleles, and the number of alleles that, his total alleles and how many of those are consistent with what's on the watch. And to remind everyone that the numbers that are provided here are the most conservative possible numbers, as in the reality could be much higher numbers than that.
Okay. And once again, the same scenario, I'm going to apply to a hypothetical with the watch. If two individuals are involved in a scuffle or physical confrontation, altercation, there's some pushing, there's some shoving, maybe some exchange of blows, and is it still possible for a DNA transfer to that watch?
If there was contact from Mr. Martin onto the surface of the watch, that could explain the low level of DNA that was found on the watch that was consistent with Mr. Martin, yes.
But that's a distinct possibility.
Yes.
Yeah, I could have a second. Dr. Spence, going back to the report that was prepared at the lab in Santa Fe, I believe that the analysis on the gun, correct me if I'm wrong, the conclusion was that it could have been 2 or more contributors to that mixture. Is that accurate?
Yes, they always say that. They never, I shouldn't say never. Sometimes I see reports where analysts will say there are 2 individuals found on this item, which they shouldn't say. If there's a major and a minor, they should say 1 individual that they've identified, and if it's minor alleles that are consistent with somebody, you can never be absolutely certain that it didn't come from more than 1 person. It's hard to break down those minor alleles that way, and the way that this analyst worded this is fine, to say that there's at least 2 on the firearm and at least 3 on the watch. Her analysis of the data, I completely agree with that assessment.
Okay. And isn't it true that DNA can remain on an item for an extended period of time, depending on the circumstances?
Yes.
And in regards to Mr. Chan's gun, there could have been other contributors to the DNA mixture deposited at some point in time prior to October the 27th of 2014. Is that true?
I would say that that's within the realm of possibilities. The DNA, as I mentioned, you cannot take the DNA typing information and put a timestamp on it. You don't know when the DNA could have been deposited on there. The typing information does not tell you that.
Okay, it could have been attributed back in his, where he worked or somewhere. That's a possibility.
Yeah, the further you go back, the less likely it's going to be. It's more likely it's a recent deposit, but you can't be certain of that by any stretch.
I understand. But once again, my final question is, that's a positive that contribution to the DNA mixture could just be as a result of a touch.
Of touching?
Yes.
The firearm or the watch? Yes.
Right. They wouldn't necessarily have that thing, their hand on it, in order for that DNA transfer to take place. I mean, a grip on it in order to take place.
Similarly, that's getting back to the timing of when the DNA went on there, or the mechanism. The DNA typing can only tell you how many alleles are there. It can tell you a lot of information about whether it resembles somebody, but it can't tell you how it got there.
Thank you, Dr. Spence.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall. Mr. Clark, is there any recross-examination, redirect examination?
So counsel asked you about a lot of hypotheticals, right?
Yes.
Touching, and all of those are certainly within the realm of possibility, right?
Yes.
But Ms. Kamir took a precaution when she swabbed this gun, at least to determine where the DNA samples were coming from, right?
Yeah, in the instance of the gun and the DNA, that was those 4 areas: the trigger guard, grip, and slide. And
you heard her testify that there was a reason why you test the trigger guard, grip, and slide, right?
Yes, because there's a lot of grooved and uneven surfaces where DNA can slough off from somebody gripping it.
And I think she also qualified that as well, as that's normally where someone would typically hold a firearm, right?
Yes.
And so while all of these other possibilities that counsel suggested are within the realm of possibility, in this case, the DNA analyst, and that you totally agree with her findings in those regards, she took special precautions, did she not, to test where an individual would typically hold a gun, hold this firearm, the grip, the trigger guard, the trigger, and the slide, right?
She did testify to that, and I agree that those are typically where you want it. I see a lot of guns that are swabbed off, and that's where the analysts always swab.
Because that's where you expect to find DNA from someone who has handled that gun.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Prindle, is there any recross-examination?
Just kind of very briefly. Dr. Spence, is it true that once the swab was taken of the different parts of that gun, and then there was a mixture that was determined to be present, the analyst who did that was not able to specifically say where that mixture came from, the trigger, the guard? It was a combined mixture.
Yes, there's instances where I see an analyst will take 6 swabs off a gun. They'll do the barrel, they'll do the grip, they'll do the trigger, they'll do the slide area, and they do them all as individual samples. That's a lot more work. But to do all those areas and combine them, you get more DNA that way, but you may not be able to pinpoint, as you said, you can't pinpoint for certainty where the DNA from either of those two individuals actually came from, except that it had to be one of those 4 areas.
Okay. And my final question is that the DNA mixture that could have come from in the past, where that gun might have been, even in Santa Fe or even in Arizona, isn't that possible?
Yes, you can't put the only thing I'd say is you can't put a timestamp on when the DNA from either of those 2 individuals was deposited on the surfaces of the firearm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pindle. Does the jury have any questions of Dr. Spence? Maybe Dr. Spence needs to. Let me ask the attorney's position. Dr. Spence, there are some questions of you by the jury. Again,
Okay.
taking into consideration the totality of your testimony. And if you are able to respond. Do you know if the secondary alleles on the firearm and the secondary alleles on the watch, do they match up with one another?
I would say that there's a high degree of similarity between those. With Mr. Chan's DNA easily being set aside, because we can see that clearly on both items.
But this addresses the secondary.
Yes, the watch has 12 alleles, as I mentioned, that could not have come from either of those gentlemen, Mr. Martin or Mr. Chan. So what is left, there's a very high degree of similarity between those two, yes.
Let me see, maybe I'm confused now. The secondary alleles that you testified to,
Yes,
you are suggesting that the secondary, that it was identified both on the firearm and on the watch, do they match up to some degree of similarity?
to a very high degree, they match up, yes. They're very consistent with each other. They appear to have come from the same person.
All right, thank you. Please explain what a latent print is.
A latent print is a fingerprint.
And again, its usefulness is to identify or match it up with an individual.
Yes.
Would the latent print be compromised if protective gloves are worn for conducting a DNA test on the gun?
That would help to lower the likelihood of any. I would certainly hope that a latent print person wouldn't wear gloves with a firearm. This would be terrible. So that would really help to wear gloves. I'm sure it's required.
Let's see if there should be a follow-up to that. Let me go to another question. What would, well, let's phrased as will, I believe it should be, what would the confirmed probability number be to link or not to link DNA on the gun to an individual? Do you understand the question in that form?
I think so, I can address it.
All right, go ahead.
In the laboratory, in a very conservative setting for looking for source attribution, to be able to say, this DNA from this known person matches this DNA on this question item, you need to be able to calculate a statistic that exceeds 300 billion to 1, meaning that theoretically you'd have to gather together 300 billion people and test them, and you would estimate only one matching, and the other, I'm not going to do all the nines, but all the rest of them would be exclusions. And so it's a very stringent requirement there, based on what the lab goes by. And this is to be extremely conservative because they don't want to say that some person's DNA, for example, is on a firearm that was used to rob a bank, and they've got a number like 1 in 500, and it may not be them. It may be some other person.
Okay, so let me again ask this question. I know that you did already address it, but please explain what 1 in 6,900, what does it mean?
What that means is theoretically you could gather together 6,900 individuals and test their DNA. Once you do that testing and compare it to the minor alleles on the firearm, you would expect, this is an estimate, you would expect to find one of those 6,900 who has matching DNA, as does Jeremy Martin. But this would be a random person who also matches, and the prediction would be, the estimation would be, that 6,899 people would be clear exclusions. Their DNA codes would all mismatch to a point where there'd be a clear exclusion. That's what that number means.
Again, I believe that this is a broader question, so look at it in that manner. What probability number are we looking at for DNA testing?
I'm not sure I understand the question. We know what the probability number is by most lab standards for a match, a scientific certainty match, and that's the 300 billion number that's really kind of way out there and overly conservative. Beyond that, the numbers, the higher the number, the more likely that that's the right person. Based on that 6,900 explanation I just gave you, the number is what it is. The 6,900's not as good a number as 50,000, but it's a much better number than 1 in 5. Because 1 in 5 would mean that we could go through this courtroom, if it's correct, and find that 20% of us have the proper alleles to be included, and only 80% don't. So that's a lot of people for just one courtroom. If that makes sense to everybody.
Well, I believe that that's the manner in which the question is being asked.
Okay.
So, having provided that answer, how is it different for the wristwatch, which was indicated as 1 in 100? Well, I don't remember that in the testimony, but nevertheless, was it?
Yes, the number was 1 in 110. And the reason why there's such a disparity, even though when you compare to Jeremy Martin, 28 of his 29 alleles are within that mix. You have to remember the wristwatch had those 12 additional alleles, and these are all low-level, weaker signals that are similar to the alleles that match Jeremy Martin. Those 12 alleles could be from anybody. We know who they're not from. They're not from Jeremy Martin, and they're not from Tai Chien. They're from some other person who at some point must have had contact with that watch. This is what drops the probability numbers way down. Because how do you know who those 12, who matches the 12, part of the 12 alleles and some of the other alleles? You get a lot more possibilities in there when you've got 28 alleles matching Mr. Martin, but maybe they're not from him, and 12 alleles that are from somebody else who we know isn't Tai Chien or Jeremy Martin. You can't make an assumption that a certain number of alleles are a clear profile of a person. You have to factor in those statistics. Whereas the firearm, it was pretty clear Tai Chan was the major, and the remaining alleles were extremely similar to Jeremy Martin, but under the stringent conservative methodology, the 6,900 number is as good as we want to put out there.
Thank you. Does the jury have any further questions of Dr. Spence? Again, Mr. Clark and Mr. Finkel, may Dr. Clark to Dr. Spence be excused?
Yes, Your Honor, you may.
Yes. Dr. Spence, thank you very much for your testimony. You have no further responsibilities unless your client indicates otherwise. So, how do you be? We're going to go ahead and recess. Let me want to caution the jury. If you make any strong commitments for tomorrow evening, you may want to excuse yourself. I'm suggesting to you, but not confirming, that this matter may be submitted for your deliberations tomorrow. At what time, I don't know. If I were to see that it's going to be very late in the afternoon, then I'm going to suggest that we would return Monday morning for the court's instructions to you, the closing arguments, and the commencement of your deliberations, because that way I would be assured that it would begin in the morning. So let me see where we go, but I want to caution you so that you're not uncomfortable or feel that you were misled in any way. Tomorrow may see the conclusion of this matter. I cannot guarantee you the time. That would be based on the length of time that the jury would engage in deliberations. All I'm suggesting to you so that you don't feel compromised or that you don't feel anxious or hurried in making a decision. You shouldn't be overly committed for tomorrow. Having said that, have a great evening, rest, because tomorrow probably will be a long day.
Please rise for the jury.
Please take your seats. The attorneys approach, please. Well, let me ask that you bring something to write on.